Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon to our participants who are joining us from South Korea. My name is John Nilsson Wright. I'm the Career Foundation Fellow at Chatham House, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on COVID-19 and the future world order. Let me begin by highlighting the fact that this is the first cooperative initiative between Chatham House and the Yeosijae Future Consensus Institute, and we are delighted to have this opportunity to partner with Yeosijae. For those of you who are not familiar with Yeosijae, Yeosijae is a relatively new think tank. It was established in 2015. Its mission is to provide policy solutions for a unified Korean peninsula and for thinking about policy change in Northeast Asia, and also for fostering the next generation of leaders both within the region and globally. So we are very excited by this new opportunity, and we welcome this chance to have an informed discussion on what is undoubtedly a very important and very large topic. Let me begin by mentioning that this discussion will be on the record. And for those of you who are joining us now, I would like to encourage you to submit your questions, if you have any, through the Q&A feature, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. But let me begin by introducing our panelists. First, Won-Soo Kim, a South Korean diplomat with more than 4 decades of experience in global and regional affairs, having served with distinction in the Korean Foreign Ministry and also very senior positions in the United Nations, with particular experience in the field of disarmament, regional security, and policy planning at the South Korean Blue House. And also significantly in terms of our new collaborative initiative, Mr. Kim serves as chair of the International Advisory Board for Yeosijae, the Future Consensus Institute. May I also introduce Robert Niblett, the director of Chatham House, who has been director at Chatham House since 2007. And last but not least, Dr. Leslie Binjamuri, head of our US program at Chatham House, and also dean of the QE2 Academy for Leadership at Chatham House. We have, as I say, a very ambitious agenda, a very large topic. It is, of course, important to highlight the success that South Korea has enjoyed in combating COVID-19. And that success, of course, has led to many important questions about the lessons that other countries, both in Europe and North America, can draw from the South Korean experience. We've seen from news reports, of course, today that South Korea and the Moon Jae-in administration is grappling with the challenge of a small uptick in infections, and this has led to a decision by the government to impose stricter social distancing measures for a period of 2 weeks. I'm sure we'll want to discuss the implications of that, but also more broadly, the question of international cooperation. What can the world learn from the experience of South Korea? All of this, of course, is happening at a time of great political change and uncertainty, particularly as it relates to the role of the United States and its relationship with China, growing tensions between the Trump administration and the leadership of Xi Jinping, concerns on the part of many observers that that tension ahead of the November elections in the United States may undercut efforts to improve global coordination. So we will have, I'm sure, a great deal to discuss. Without further ado, I'd like Robert Niblett to kick off with a few minutes of presentation, setting the scene, if you like, in terms of understanding the impact of COVID-19 and thinking about questions of global order. Robin, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. Great to see you in this new COVID way that we do currently in the United Kingdom. I say in the United Kingdom, of course, John, you're in Paris right now, so we already have some differentiation here, and obviously pleased to be with my colleague, Leslie Binjamuri. We're both in London, which is at least relatively proximate. And Won-Soo, wonderful to see you again virtually from such a distance. And I'm only sorry that for this first collaboration between Chatham House and Yeosijae, the Future Consensus Institute, we're having to do it virtually like this. Although I think the net result is we're probably reaching a lot more people, which is the positive aspect of the meetings we're all able to carry out right now in this virtual format. Though for many of you, just to let you know, I had the pleasure of actually visiting Yeosijae's headquarters back in October of last year. So It's a shame not to be able to be doing it physically, but nonetheless, I don't want to use up too much of my time, doing on the introductions, because we are trying to cover a massive topic. The future of world order is, one of those small topics that one was always challenged by prior to COVID-19, but with the coronavirus crisis, as many people have noted, accelerating many of the previous trends that we already saw at Chatham House, starting to influence the world of international affairs. This is even more pronounced today. And I just want to lay out kind of 6, I suppose, big trends that I see taking place, and which hopefully will give us a structure or at least some ideas to be able to follow up on in the Q&A, and also for my colleagues to either challenge or agree with or move off. Actually, I want to start not with the geopolitical, actually, but more with the kind of socioeconomic change, which has been characterized as moving from a just-in-time to a just-in-case world. In other words, rather than a world of hypervelocity, of speed of economic activity, of speed of travel, of deeply integrated supply chains that allowed low price, active economic activity, linking all corners of the world together. That world which we'd become so accustomed to, and around which we've built a lot of our economic activity, strikes me as now, at least for the near term, but it could become the new normal, to use that phrase, of becoming just-in-case world. In other words, a world in which governments have to think a lot more carefully about their engagement with the rest of the world, their exposure or their vulnerability to supply chains that could suddenly be cut off, or just to the type of activity domestically and socially that runs at such a form of physical proximity and speed that it causes the risks of the kind of coronavirus outbreak that we've had now to return. And that's the big fear, I think, certainly in the West, in London and Europe, I think in America, the fear that just as we come out of this first experience for us of this type of a virus in practically 100 years, that it could return again. And the question this raises, how can you fund growth and the rate of economic growth that we've become accustomed to in a just-in-case type of economic world? What does it mean for emerging economies that were hoping to raise themselves out of either the middle income trap, as in China or Brazil or parts of Southeast Asia, into developed status? What does it mean for countries in sub-Saharan Africa? Their ability to move up the value chain, to increase wealth by being engaged in globalization. If globalization economically is less integrated, moving at a less fast speed, the opportunity for these countries to rise becomes more difficult. Levels of debt that are already going to be much higher at the end of this crisis become harder to pay down. So to me, this idea of a move from just-in-time, hyper-velocity, deeply integrated global economy to a just-in-case world is one of the biggest changes we're likely to see happen. And it will have spillovers, to my second point, into an acceleration of some of the pre-existing trends, particularly around geopolitics. We already saw prior to the COVID-19 outbreak a deepening of the competition and the sense of suspicion between the United States and China in particular. We'll spend more time talking about it. I think all of our participants, audience, all of our guests on this call will understand that the drivers of this competition, but in particular, a United States that I think in a nutshell, and Leslie will talk more about this in a minute, a United States that has seen China as a country that has been taking advantage of globalization, of its engagement in the global economy, not to become more integrated with the multilateral system as was, not by becoming a more engaged member of the world based on a rule of law, based on becoming more politically plural, but that actually has used that global integration to strengthen itself and its own communist model in a way that is seen as threatening to US interests and to those of its allies. And in a way, what America is now saying, not just to China, but to other countries around the world, is whose side are you on? And the COVID-19 crisis and the fact that it originated in China, the fact that there was early efforts to close it and hide it up and to hide it, and the fact that China has been so forward-moving in pushing its own agenda afterwards means that the US is much more skeptical about China and its engagement, and all of us are going to be pulled into that process. The third big trend I wanted to mention is that we're going to see around all of the world government much more involved in all aspects of economic activity. The kind of just-in-time world I described before, the world of hyper-globalization, was one that saw a reduction or a decline in the role of governments in economic activity. And the rise of multinational companies, the rise of transnational organizations. Now we're seeing governments being called back in, certainly in Western countries like Britain, the United States, parts of Europe, into playing much more active role in economic activity. And this raises a big question of what it means for the future of capitalism. And I think you're going to find a lot of Western governments distracted from their normal international engagement to becoming much more self-obsessed, much more internally focused in developing a new social contract between the government and the people expecting governments to protect them much more than in the past, to provide answers much more than in the past. Governments will struggle to provide that confidence, but it doesn't mean that they won't try. And this brings me to the fourth point. What does the new COVID-19 world look like for international cooperation and multilateralism? The geopolitical changes I described a minute ago, deeper US-China competition in particular, were already making multilateralism a less positive or a less fluid force in the world. The WTO has become frozen. The UN Security Council is struggling to move forward. The World Health Organization has become politicized. But what you also see potentially happening in a world where national governments play a bigger role protecting their citizens, and where people see globalization as giving some people the advantage over other people, then the value of those big multilateral organizations becomes much less. If cooperation potentially increases vulnerability in the eyes of some people, then you may see much less investment in those multilateral organizations. I would say I am not entirely negative, however, about multilateral organization. I think at the political level, it's tougher. But even through this COVID crisis, we've seen what I call technical multilateralism actually continue to move forward. A very good example would be the decision in the G20 by finance ministers to agree to roll over debt of some of the most highly indebted countries in the world, in particular in Africa, but in other parts as well. And we've seen some efforts by other organizations like the European Investment Bank to do a new partnership with the World Health Organization to roll out new health diagnostics and healthcare support to poorer countries around the world. So what you might see is a sort of multilateral cooperation at a more technical level, but at that high level of political commitment, I see it much less likely. My last, very quickly, two comments would be about where climate change fits into all of this. Because I think we can forget, here we are just 3 months after the Davos meeting in Switzerland, that gathering of economic and political leaders from around the world. And at that meeting, the absolute dominant issue was the need finally to adjust to climate change. And how can we change business practices, human practices, the shape of trade, the shape of taxation even, to be able to meet the climate change. So the huge question is, does that agenda go away for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years as the world economy recovers from COVID, or is it more deeply embedded? I sense that certainly from a European perspective, the commitment to try to drive economies towards the goals of combating climate change will be even higher in this post-COVID world. But it doesn't necessarily help globalization, because the EU will start to impose a sort of border tax based on the amount of carbon that is inside the imports that come into the EU, in order to try to equalize the price of any import with the cost of locally produced goods that must take carbon much more actively into account. So that climate agenda, I think, is going to be pushed very hard by Western countries, the Green New Deals, etc., but it could make that globalization force even weaker. Last comment, I don't have enough time, I've spoken for too long. I think we'll see a more regionalization of the global economy. I can talk about that in Q&A. And of course, I'm not going to say anything about this, but where the US election goes in November will be the biggest unknown variable. I think it'll have a big impact on global cooperation depending on the outcome of the US election. Let me stop there, John. Sorry for going a couple of minutes over.
No, Robin, that was extremely helpful, and thank you for giving us that very comprehensive tour of the horizon. Just to sort of lay down a marker for our later discussion, I mean, you mentioned the importance of government taking on a greater role in dealing with some of these issues. It will be interesting, I'm sure, to think about whether we need new models or whether history provides us with any powerful examples. There's been a lot of talk about New Deals, echoing the experience of the Roosevelt administration back in the 1930s, particularly in the context of climate change. How important will be historical experience in shaping the way in which governments respond to this crisis? But let's leave that for one moment. And let me now turn to Won-Soo in Seoul to give a Korean perspective on the issues we're discussing. Won-Soo, over to you.
Thank you, John, for your kind introduction, and also thank Robin for your excellent tour of the world. And I think, and also I'm very happy to see all of you safe and healthy, braving the virus. And it is good to engage with all of you online. And I think at least maybe, although Robin said it is a pity, but I take it as a kind of privilege. Now we can do these things more frequently without even the burden of international travel and spending a lot of time in the air. And COVID-19 has brought to the fore dual crisis, health and economic, on a scale unprecedented after the Second World War. And I like to take 2 points Robin has made. The first on the impact side, and I share your concern about this virus may hit us again this fall, because what I'm now seeing worldwide trend is that now we have seen spikes in Latin America, and I remain deeply concerned about then what had happened to Africa. And then countries in the north are struggling to cope with it. And if it hits the countries in the global south, they need the help from the global north, but global north countries are busier and preoccupied with taking care of their own problems. So then how we organize our international response. And if we don't think of a international mechanism which can help countries in the global south cope with the problems in time, otherwise it will swing back to us and to haunt us back. And about international cooperation, as Robin pointed out, the trend I'm seeing is really worrying, because the impact COVID-19 has brought on health front and also on economic front. Already it surpasses the level of economic pain we see from 2008-9 global financial crisis, popularly called a Great Recession. And with quarantine and safety measures, including lockdown, are still ongoing in many parts of the world, the economic pain is going to climb higher and higher and closer to the level of Great Depression, the worst economic crisis we had over the last 100 years. So I would call the pain we have now as something already more than, in economic terms, more than great recession of 2008-9 crisis, but we have the pain individually, family-wise, society, socially, and nationally and internationally on health and personal well-being front. So if we combine these two pains, the social and economic, I would call maybe great disruption of our social and economic lives. And as you also pointed out, Robin, this is happening at a time when the world was already experiencing rising division inside the nations as well as among nations. At the highest level, as you aptly described, US-China relationship among G2, the two most powerful states, already transited from strategic cooperation from 1970s to 1990s in the post-Cold War period to strategic competition. And now the signs we have in the aftermath of a national and international response to COVID-19 exacerbates that trend. So I'm afraid with the COVID-19 induced crisis, we are now seeing on top of a great disruption in times of great division. So these two great Ds, it's a bad combination, but now with the absence of global leadership needed to tackle this problem, we may descend into maybe Great Depression or even beyond. And also, as you pointed out, we are now seeing rising populist rhetorics and also in polarized political context, and also narrow-minded nationalist barriers and fervors, and this may also will lead to rising protectionism, beggar thy neighbor mentality. And then we all know what happened after Great Depression, and it led to very dire consequences for all the humanity. So we have shared incentive to prevent these combination of two great Ds from pushing the world for the descent into disastrous scenario we all don't want to see. But what we can do, I mean, we are living in a world, global order, maybe dominated by G2, but in terms of necessary leadership, we are living in a, I think, I'm afraid it's G0, leadership vacuum. And if we wait for US-China to narrow down their differences and miraculously come back to us, to the world about the solution, we are all happy to join. And that's what happened when world international community coped with 2008-9 crisis. Thanks to the convergence of views among US and China, G20 could pull the international community out of the crisis relatively quickly and successfully. But now, we are seeing the opposite trend among G2. And I'm afraid that that scenario doesn't look very likely, at least until the US presidential election is over, and even after the election is over, regardless of who wins the election, I'm afraid that maybe long-term trend of US-China relationship has been already set in motion, moving from further away from strategic competition, maybe more precisely strategic cooperative competition to strategic confrontational competition. And who knows if this downward trend continues, it may descend into strategic confrontation. And that's the scenario we all have to work together to prevent it, to mitigate that risk coming from a G2 absence of global leadership now in the world. And I welcome today's e-meeting as the beginning of maybe our joint thinking process, because I think like-minded countries like Korea and the UK share a lot of things in common. And we believe in liberal democracy and free market economy, and also we are two of the top dozen economies in the world, and we are maintaining close relationship economically and politically with both G2, US and China. So we have shared incentive to think of something before it becomes too late to do something for the rest of the world. And then whatever mechanism we can think of for mitigating that risk, I mean, we can remain open to G2. I mean, it is up to them whether they can join or not. And I like to take your suggestion also about climate change agenda, because this COVID-19 crisis highlighted the unsustainability crisis we are creating, and including climate change risk, because of human activities destroying the habitat of wild animals. We may force the virus to begin the journey to migrate from the previous host, from animal to animals to humans eventually now. And also we are maybe unleashing, without knowing, through climate change induced global warming, glaciers melting, and viruses once trapped in the glacier now begin to be released. So this crisis has direct linkage to unsustainability crisis humankind has created and climate change agenda. So I think that one idea to take your suggestion for technical functional multilateralism for the future, and also along the functional areas of high risk, high probability, high consequences, climate change and sustainability as the agenda, which can link like-minded countries like UK, Korea. UK has a special role to play as the chair of the current COP process of climate change agreement. And also we can expand to include countries, like-minded countries from other regions like Australia in Oceania, and European countries, and Canada in North America. So that maybe we can call Green New Deal Coalition as a provider of comprehensive solutions to COVID-19 induced crisis, and to mitigate the greater risk we are now facing for the whole humanity. So I want to throw that out as kind of food for thought for a possible international cooperative mechanism for the immediate future, so that at least like-minded countries can pool our thinking and wisdom together. And I hope this process will be the first step toward that long-term direction with involving other like-minded countries. Back to John, thank you.
Wonsu, thank you very much for that very sobering listing of all of the challenges we face. I mean, I think your idea of the 2Ds captures it very neatly, but I was very pleased to see that amidst all of this concern, there is the glimmer of a possible set of responses, linking together our two countries. I'm sure we'll want, again, to lay down a marker to think about some of those strategic conflict risks that you mentioned, and maybe to think about a hierarchy of risks so that we understand what the primary challenges are going to be looking ahead into the immediate future. You also mentioned the importance of leadership, which is a natural point of segue to Leslie and the role of the United States, the so-called indispensable superpower, which at the moment seems, at least by all accounts, to be less engaged in tackling some of these problems, both at home and abroad, if one took a critical perspective. But I don't want to preempt Leslie's remarks. So over to you, Leslie.
Thank you. I should say thank you, obviously, to John and Robin, but to you, Wonsu, Kim, I'm very grateful to have the opportunity. And respect your work a tremendous amount. And so it's lovely to meet you in the virtual world, in the digital world that we now have. I'm going to be brief because I can see that there are a lot of questions coming in. I guess I would start by saying, I like the 2 Ds and I loved Robin's points, but I'm, inevitably, since I'm coming third, I have to be even more optimistic. Otherwise, we're all going to have we have a long day ahead of us, Robin and I. And I would say maybe our 2 Ds should be that we're divided, but we're certainly dynamic. And the great question for this period in time is, great crises tend to produce great change. And so the big question, and I don't think we can know the answer, is to what extent will that be the case, and where will that change and that dynamism come from? Let me say a couple of quick things about the international context, and then just say a little bit very quickly about the US, a country that I think we're all too much aware of at the moment. But just to add to Robin's comment about the middle income drop, I think is very interesting. Robin set the scene with these 6 comments, but one of them was, to what extent will countries in transition trying to move up that economic ladder get stuck as a result of the changed global economic context? And the point that I want to add to this, I guess, are 2. One is, one of the things that concerns me both in the US context and globally is not only states and states in transition, but it's also demographics, right? Because this global crisis is clearly having very uneven demographic impacts. And the one I think that is very interesting and telling is that between older generations and younger generations. That's something that's been of differential concern across the globe. Fewer younger people in Europe, more young people in Africa, right? It hits different parts of the globe very, very differently. But there's no doubt that the diminished opportunities and the increased responsibilities that we're placing on younger generations is extraordinary, and something that we must pay very serious, very careful attention to in terms of our analysis, and that we must have absolutely concrete solutions to. The young are going to be asked to solve the problems at a time when they are going to be gravely handicapped. And unlike many of us, and especially Wansu and Robin and John, they won't have had, this will be their entry point into the world. The digital world is their entry point. It's not 20 years of travel and then they move digital. So for any number of reasons, I think the demographic impact, and especially the age impact, is going to be one that we need to watch and really, really highlight. And I guess related to that, but it goes back to the question of, what happens with the middle powers, with countries that are in the middle income. That has been that's where we've looked to as a point of nudging, right? As the US and China have brought us into a bit of a deadlock on multilateralism, on globalism, we've looked to a number of middle powers to nudge us forward into cooperative, creative solutions. And one of the big questions for me is, to what extent do those middle powers, are they still able to play that role? Does that trajectory increase, or does it get logjam? Because actually, the great white hope for the future, those countries perhaps have to also turn more inwards and become more challenged by internal nationalist problems. So, there are things changing, not only obviously in the major geopolitical confrontation, but those demographics and those middle income countries, I think there's a real question about what happens there going forward. So just a couple of things on the US. I mean, clearly what happens in November is game changing, not only for the 300 and however many million Americans, not only for economic recovery in the United States, but also for the rest of the world. The US is in a period of tremendous dynamism. You didn't expect me to say that, did you? It is tremendously dynamic right now in terms of people trying to actively create and solve problems related to the pandemic and the economic crisis. It's in a state of, I have never heard the words the Wild West used more than I have in the last 2 weeks. I mean, we know about the Wild West in America, but my God, every single person that I talk to who's living in America says it's the Wild West. So things are really dynamic, right? They are changing rapidly. obviously, we woke up to the news of race riots in the coasts in Minneapolis. This is devastating. That race is now being triggered through the very disastrous, shameful violence against an American citizen, George Floyd. But it's layered on top of a grave economic crisis, an extraordinarily devastating health crisis. 100,000 Americans have died, and the numbers are increasing. 40 million have registered for unemployment benefits. So race, demographic challenges, polarization, it's hitting the blue states more than the red states. It's hitting the blue areas within states more than the red areas. But even though we are seeing tremendous polarization, and the dividing line right now is between those who want to get back to work and those who want to protect their health and their family's health. And some of that, to go back to my original point, some of that is about age. Not all of it's going to break down according to whether you are Republican or Democrat. Some of that's about age, and some of that is about gender, right? Women in red states and in red families are not breaking down the same way as men because they're thinking about their families and their children. That's not, entirely the case, but we are seeing this kind of division. So it's a very, very dynamic period where I don't think that we can assume that the existing lines of division will come out the same as, as they currently are. What does that mean for America's role in the world? I'll close very quickly with this. Obviously, the election is game changing. It's not only going to be game changing because it's a vote on Donald Trump, and obviously if Biden comes into play, we have a president who's very fixated on China. He's very, very concerned with democracy. The human rights agenda is back in play in a very serious way. Alliances are back into play in a very, very serious way. But it's the layers of people below Joe Biden that really, I think, changed the game. The biggest devastation for the world in the Trump administration really, yes, of course, it's that Trump is difficult to predict and difficult to work with, but it's that there's nothing below him that you can be sure of. And I think as soon as you get a change in the administration, if that's what happens, God knows, right now it looks like there will be a change. November is light years away. We are living in a pandemic. It is light years away. It is impossible to know what America will look like or how people will feel by November. They might feel like, thank God they're back to work. Thank God the president let them go to the movies again. Or they might feel like they've lost their grandparents and they've lost their wives and they will never look Donald Trump in the eye again. We cannot predict it. But if there were to be a change in administration, we will see a level of high-level elite bureaucrats return to govern the country. They will be constrained by domestic crisis. They will be constrained by the US-China confrontation and hard line on trade, but they will be serious people. There will be rigor in the democracy. And I think that is, the potential game changer for the United States and the rest of the world going forward.
Leslie, thank you very much. Reassuring to know that dynamism is a source of optimism, and perhaps also opportunities for the return of legitimate expertise in government, your last point, I think, which is worth thinking about. Let me start by picking up one of the questions we've had from one of our Korean listeners about middle powers, which also builds on what Leslie was saying. What is the role for countries like not only South Korea, but the UK, Australia, Japan? And this is a question for all three of you. To Wonsu, South Korea's experience as a middle power is often cited in terms of its policy towards Southeast Asia and ASEAN, but there have been very significant concerns about the ability of South Korea to cooperate with some of its regional partners, most obviously tensions between South Korea and Japan. Do you think that the current crisis will help to overcome some of the historical tensions that have dominated that relationship? To Robin, on the question of middle powers, a question I'm sure all of us are going to be asking, capacity constraints in the case of the British government, not only given that it is experiencing such a challenge in managing the question of COVID-19 with very high levels of fatalities, but also, of course, this happening simultaneously with Brexit. What's your assessment of how Britain manages those twin challenges with the current domestic political situation in the UK undermining some of the popularity of our Prime Minister? And lastly, to Leslie, yes, middle powers, But how much appetite does Donald Trump have, if any, to provide space for those middle powers to actually flex their geopolitical and policy-making muscles, if you like? So Won-Soo, perhaps if you'd like to start.
I mean, difficult question for any Korean to answer. But of course, when we think about any coalition of like-minded countries along shared values and shared interests, I mean, from our region, Japan, obviously, what comes as the first candidate for such cooperation. But as you know very well, we have sensitive history and other issues still lingering and haunting us. Whenever Japan and Korea try to move on in a forward-looking manner, some issues from the past are coming back and hampering our ability to move forward. But still, I believe, as you said, we have shared interest, and also we share alliance with the United States, and we are facing a lot of challenges together, common security challenges on the Korean Peninsula, but also in now even managing our alliance relationship with the US under President Trump. So I hope the COVID-19 response must help leaders in both Korea and Japan to look forward into the future when we think about what to do regionally, but also globally, and also toward our common alliance, United States. But of course, politics are very difficult to predict now, because now Korea just went through a parliamentary election, which ended landslide victory for the government. And Prime Minister Abe will face important milestone in his political calendar next year now with postponed Olympics, and also maybe for his own future in party and the government leadership. So I hope sense of pragmatism will prevail on the political leaders so that they can look beyond immediate term political interest calculation, but toward what should be the shared future through better cooperation between Korea and Japan. So I hope I can see the brighter future of relationship between Korea and Japan, but of course, it depends a lot what political leaders will choose to do.
Thank you. Robin.
Thank you, and I'm glad Won-Soo raised the issue of the role of middle powers, and I think when he mentioned those mid-sized countries, we may or may not be powers, it reminded me that's one of my takeaways, Leslie, from our conversation yesterday about world order. I think something we should have in our paper. I'm just going to say that in front of everyone here, because I think this idea of like-minded, that's a slightly awkward phrase, but like-minded countries trying to find a way to play a constructive role at a time of G2, China-US competition, but doing it in a way that upholds their values, their systems of government, their commitments to democracy, to transparency, to open markets, becomes all the more important. And if you don't mind me, John, just because I was skimming through some of the questions that came in, there's one from Kogila Balakrishnan, if I pronounced your name right, Kogila. So, how do you avoid a return to the World War II thing, post-depression, post-protectionism? My answer would have been along the lines of my answer to your question, John, which is countries that do not want to get caught up in that G2 competition, that want to avoid the return, are going to have to step up. Now, that's easy to say. Your question is, you raised about the UK. So the UK is a classic country that should step up, to play that kind of a role. fifth, sixth largest economy in the world, a P5 UN Security Council member, etc., etc. Like all countries, and Won-Soo kind of mentioned some of the dynamics in South Korea, all of our domestic politics are far more intense at this precise COVID-19 moment. So the ability to look out and think creatively about how to step in and take some of that responsibility for multilateral cooperation at a time of G2 competition is nice in theory, but very difficult in practice. You then throw Brexit, or let's remind everyone here, UK has Brexited. We're already not members of the EU. It's hard to remember this now and again because the UK is still inside the single market and we still seem to be negotiating with the EU, or a bit negotiating, which is the truth. But certainly, and probably by the end of this year, the UK will be out of the single market as well. And it may have left with a very sour, difficult relationship with its EU European neighbors if this negotiation goes badly. And some of those neighbors should be the partners in middle power diplomacy. Yeah, because the middle powers are always South Korea, Japan, Australia, Canada, UK, France, Germany. You know, you think of all of those, the usual list. But it's a big reminder to me that all middle powers exist in their regional context. And in their regional contexts, on the security side, we tend to get pulled into a US orbit, which makes it very difficult then to triangulate between the US and China, when, as most Western powers, we rely on the US for our security. And I think more broadly, our capacity to coordinate then gets pushed just into some very high-level topics. Let me say what they are. Climate change is a good example. Debt forgiveness, this very important question. The support for Africa, for example, is an area where I think you could potentially get some commonality of middle country development assistance, debt forgiveness, market approaches, etc. It might even be that a post-COVID health, reforming the WHO, the World Health Organization, given that this has become an area of contest between the US and China, maybe this is a space where the middle powers could try to come through the middle. Come through the middle powers, that makes sense, to try to come up with some answers. But what we're going to need in each case is a sort of aggregating capacity. In other words, a forum that allows us as a group to come together. So maybe it's in the G20. Maybe it's an expansion of the G7 or sort of something in parallel to the G7, if you see what I'm saying. It is COP26 for the UK. So the UK is distracted, but it's got no choice but to live up to COP26 and its co-chairmanship with Italy, remember, with Italy of the COP26, and try to use some of these formats that would force us middle powers together and use that as a way to aggregate our capacity without being exposed to the G2 competition quite as intensely. Sorry, long answer, but a very important question.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. And that leads neatly on to Leslie in terms of this question of alliances and dealing with security challenges. Joseph Nye said a long time ago that the United States was bound to lead. Can it lead? Or can it allow other countries to increasingly step into the power vacuum that Won-Soo was referring to?
I mean, I'm not so sure it's a power vacuum. I think it's much more intense than that. It might be easier if it was a power vacuum, but I guess the one advantage of having a president who's erratic but also distracted is that you can do a lot when America's not paying attention or just kind of has its eye off the ball. So there's a lot of opportunity. We might see if there's a change in presidency that, getting in line with America is going to become much more important, not in a negative way, but just in a, the big kid is back on the block sort of way. So, there is something about Trump that has given space because you're not bound to be loyal because Trump is not loyal, right? So a lot of things are going to change. I guess the only other thing I would add, because I'm sure you want to get onto the many questions, and I noticed that Mark Ticola is in the audience, which is wonderful. I haven't seen Mark in years. I think, a big dividing line will be not just middle powers, but it's going to be democracies. I just think this question of democracy is going to be very, very, very central, especially if there's a change of administration. And so it won't just be, you know, is there room for middle powers, but I think there will be a dividing line between democracy being given a certain kind of voice and that becoming much more tense between democracies and the rest.
Great. Some specific questions from our audience, which I think I want to highlight. One is the question of global health, which we haven't really talked about in great detail. One question on the issue of vaccines. Is there a global race underway to develop a vaccine? How can we ensure a greater pooling of information and resources? And related to that, this very important question from Kenneth Davis, what's the most appropriate way to strike a balance between ensuring self-reliance in medical supplies and other strategic assets and maintaining global supply chains? Now, I think again of the experience of South Korea, sending PPE to Maryland on the request of the governor there, whose wife is a ethnic Korean. I mean, I'd like you all to reflect on this question. How much progress has been achieved to date? What are the obstacles to ensuring that collaboration and avoiding the risk that countries will increasingly turn inwards in terms of thinking about their response to the health pandemic? Won-Soo, would you like to start?
Yes. From my experience of handling earlier health crises like H1N1 in 2009 and 2014 Ebola crisis in West Africa, always it's a difficult exercise to develop vaccines. It's bound to take time and it costs a lot. But at least one good thing is a bit of irony this time is that this virus hits those in the global north. Now, global pharmaceutical industry has very strong incentive to join in the search for vaccines. That's the good news. But the possibly risky side of it is that whoever gets there to develop a safe, effective, and scalable vaccines. And then the next question is then who will get it first? So if we just leave it to the market logic, and I think then it'll be very risky for the world, particularly for those countries in the global south who cannot afford to have any affordable access to vaccines for the future. So we have to think of an international regime. Whoever gets the vaccine first, it must be made equitably accessible to all countries in the world. And I think, I cannot think of any international organization with all criticisms, legitimate and sometimes overblown to WHO. I cannot think of any other organization who can lead this global exercise. And we always have done a post-mortem exercise after H1N1 crisis was over, after Ebola crisis over. And always there is a criticism on WHO. But also we have to remember international organization, as also Robin pointed out, can be as effective as its principal shareholders, member states, most powerful states allow it. So we cannot blame all the problems we have now, up to now, in international response to WHO. It is unfair to them because most of the decisions they are taking have been made with the participation and maybe stronger voices of powerful states, powerful member states of those organizations. But because we all know that whenever something goes wrong, international organizations should take the blame. But this is one perfect example that international organization should be strengthened and should be given more resources and more voices in how we can come up with equitable and safe and effective vaccine for everybody in the world. And also,
Won-Soo, I'm going to stop you there if I may, because I want to bring in a few questions. That's really helpful.
Okay.
Let me stop here. 3 very quick questions for all of you to think about. The question of Hong Kong, very topical. Azmat Khan asks, to what extent is the global community being distracted from the question of Hong Kong? How should we respond to it? A question from an old friend, Akio Miyajima, asking, specifically, Robin, what do you think is needed for the upcoming UN General Assembly to revive multilateral cooperation to cope with global challenges? Who do you think can be good partners for South Korea to work together for consolidating multilateralism? And then a related question on political multilateralism. Is it in decline, as Robin has argued? What incentives can be provided for states and the private sector to strengthen political multilateralism, whether that's addressing the question of a vaccine or other global public goods? Perhaps we can start with those questions. And I'll begin with Robin and then come to Leslie.
Thanks for those questions. And I'll just try to be telegraphic so you can get as many in as you can. On Hong Kong, no, look, I don't think this is a matter of distraction. The Chinese government will have planned and has been planning, I'm sure, this move for quite a long time. And it probably would have been done and taken now, even without the coronavirus crisis, given the fact that the Hong Kong legislature is frozen, has not been able to pass a national security law since it came into existence. And C.H. Tung failed when he was the chief executive in 2003. And with the breakout of the protests, I think the Chinese government had decided, as they have the right to do under the Basic Law Agreement, Article 18, as I understand it, they decided to just impose it themselves, not the outcome that was meant to be done, but an outcome that they had a sort of nuclear option, you could say, to use if they wanted to. So I don't think they did this because they were distracted. I don't think they think the West is distracted either, the UK or the US. I think they just feel they've got nothing to lose. The relationship is bad enough as it is, and they're willing to take the risk. In fact, they probably knew it would inflame and give even more ammunition to the Trump administration and to, one might argue more broadly, the West as a whole. There's been very tough language, or tougher language, coming out of London about having to rethink its relationship with China. The golden era that was brought about in the David Cameron government seems to be pretty buried. And even Boris Johnson is struggling to keep the line to the pragmatic approach of, for example, allowing Huawei to be in the 5G market, but only up to 30%. Even that line may break in the coming months, and we may find a change in the British government position on this to having a timeline in which Huawei would have to move entirely out of the 5G or all of the telecom market. That may still happen. So this is a long way of saying I don't think this is about distraction. What it is it just reflects the fact of the complete breakdown in trust between Western powers and China feeling it'll do what it thinks is in its interest, and it will just take the risks that follow. And yes, this makes it a much more fraught environment, but there's a huge limit to what countries like the UK can do. The US obviously can take some economic steps and probably will in terms of its distinct status as a separate trading country with preferential agreements with the US. To Akio Miyajima, Akio, great to hear you on this call. What can we do? I think I'll be very quick on this. What can we do to push multilateralism at the upcoming UN General Assembly? I hate to say it this way, I wouldn't bother. I just think in the lead up to the US presidential election, I'm afraid, and with all of the tension that exists at that political level, it's very difficult, I think, to come up with a constructive agenda. I think, however, there might be some room on this point on health. There may be some processes that could be given the green light by the UN system, maybe sort of pre-positioning of health resources, treaties or agreements where countries agree that they will commit to supply a certain amount of supplies, a commitment to make sure that any vaccine is globally available, where intellectual property restrictions are limited, a capacity to go generic very quickly. I think there's all sorts of steps where maybe the UN General Assembly, being the parent, or the UN being the parent of the WHO, they could use this moment to try to re-energize health multilateralism now, given, as I said earlier, that it's become such a contentious area for China and the US. And I think just lastly on incentives for private sector, so important. I think the private sector in terms of global companies are actually going to be taking the lead on a lot of the moves towards the green economy, towards greater transparency on taxation. There's a demand by the big multinationals at a time when governments are fighting each other. Companies still have global consumers. They have the internet, which exposes all of their activity. If governments are not going to provide regulations, the private sector is going to work with civil society, with individuals to try to come up with better ideas. So I think it's an opportunity to work with the private sector.
We're just about out of time. I'm going to let Leslie have a final comment on the question of geopolitics. We had a couple of questions looking at the question of India. And at the moment, we have tensions between China and India, border disputes. Kalim Hussein asks about the risk of a rise of political extremism domestically within India. In terms of some of the strategic flashpoints, your insights, Leslie, before we wrap up what has been a very interesting session.
I'll say one thing on India, which is I do think that it's an area where we will see a shift in US policy if Biden were to be elected. In other words, if you think, I think perhaps Trump's last big international trip before the pandemic was to India. And we all know what happened surrounding that trip, the riots, and he said nothing and turned a blind eye. I don't think that we'll see that going forward. India will continue to be very strategically important, but the democracy part of India will be re-embedded into that relationship. And I think that will be raise lots of questions for India. And it will raise a lot of questions for the US. Will it actually enforce a red line? How serious will it take that agenda? I want to just add one more quick thing to what Robin said about the UNGA. I know he didn't mean it. And the reason I would say that it's tremendously important in this current context to take the UNGA seriously is that the conduct of the election has been stymied by at the operational level by the pandemic. So every forum that there is to give voice to the values that one thinks are important, and if one thinks that multilateralism is important, the UNGA is going to get a tremendous amount of press. It's going to elevate some voices and depress others, or perhaps shine a light on some campaigns that are, that get less traction. So it is an opportunity. All of these forums are opportunities to have the public debate that isn't going to be had in person in the same way leading up to November. So from the point of view of, somebody who thinks about the US, and frankly, from a US citizen point of view, I think take advantage to really invest in what the world thinks is important in those, because it's about keeping that debate alive, playing the long game, frankly, playing the short game, because November is very soon.
Leslie, thank you. And thank you for ending on a somewhat optimistic note. I think it's important for us to recognize that there are existing institutional frameworks that will provide a forum, whether in real time or virtually, for some of the engagement with the critical issues we've covered. We have just scratched the surface, I think it's fair to say, but I want to thank all of our participants for engaging so actively with these issues, and to apologize to the audience. We had a tremendous number of questions. I'm afraid we weren't able to get to all of them, only a small proportion, but I think it's been a very illuminating and I hope rewarding discussion for all of you who've been listening, wherever you might be. To thank Yeosijae again, the Future Consensus Institute, for their new partnership with us at Chatham House. We look forward to doing many more of these virtual events and advancing our own research agenda together to address some of these really important issues. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, John.